Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar and deputy director here of education policy here at AEI. And we're pleased to have you here for this event today. Choosing college, can students be better consumers? Today, college looks very different than it did 2 or 3 decades ago. Now, students can choose between traditional 4- and 2-year institutions, but increasingly they have options such as online programs, boot camps, certificate programs, apprenticeships, and more. The choice among these options that students and families face is all the more complicated by the costs and benefits associated with them and the kinds of doors they can open up. With so many higher education options available, it's worth having a conversation to better understand how students make their choices about college and how they might make better choices. Michael Horn, a higher education expert and the co-author of the new book, Choosing College, How to Make Better Learning Decisions Throughout Your Life, is just the person to have that conversation with. The book explores how students can make better learning decisions throughout their lives, and it draws on interviews with hundreds of students and provides a framework that might help students make better choices. For today's conversation, we have the event being live streamed. We'd like everyone to participate online, and on Twitter we have a hashtag. It's hashtag Choosing College. You can chime in with questions that we can ask the panel later on. The video from the live stream will be available as soon as we conclude in full. Also, after, for those in the audience, the books will be available out here in the hall for purchase. And again, Choosing College is also available wherever fine books are sold. We have a simple program. I'm going to invite Michael to come up in just a moment with Jason Delisle, and they're going to have a conversation on the book for a few minutes. And following that, 2 other folks are going to come up, Howell and Carrie Warick, which I'm going to allow Jason to introduce when they're ready to come up on the stage to round out a wider discussion of the book. So Jason is the perfect person to have this discussion with. He is a higher education policy expert here at AEI. His research focuses on higher ed finance and student loan repayment. Jason's career started on Capitol Hill, where he worked in the office of Representative Petrie and then as an analyst for the U.S. Senate Committee on the Budget. Michael Horn is the author and co-author of multiple books on education, including Choosing College, his latest book, which just came out last week. He's the head of strategy at Entangled Group and the co-founder and distinguished fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute. With that, I'll leave it to Michael and Jason.
Okay, so thanks for coming and doing this.
Thanks for having me so I could do this.
So the book, let's get really important things clear right now. The book is out now.
It is out now, and it's actually shipping from Amazon and not just out in your hallway. Yep.
Okay, all right. Yeah, because I got an early copy, so I want to make sure. Okay.
Well, you're special, so yes.
Okay, so where did the idea come from for the book? Like, what's the genesis?
So the genesis of it was at the Christensen Institute about 4 or 5 years ago. Some researchers and I were sitting there, and we had this hypothesis that a lot of people were coming to college for a myriad of reasons, that they had a lot of what we call jobs to be done, that they were essentially hiring college to do for them, and colleges were trying to be all things to all people, and as a result of that, they were sort of becoming one-size-fits-none shops, where they were serving, they had students who needed very different things on opposite ends, and they were sort of pulling against each other and not serving any student particularly well and not optimized for different students. And so our hypothesis as a result was you were getting colleges creating subpar offerings and also having administrative and overhead costs just increasing through the roof, trying to balance all this complexity. And we know that complexity leads to that administrative overhead. And so our hypothesis was, let's just dig into this and figure it out. I will tell you that as we started to do the research and started talking to stories and essentially creating mini documentaries of how they made the choice, we were shocked by what we found and sort of the stories that evolved. And we said, we should write a book that sort of puts these stories out there and lets people learn from them, identify themselves in them, and hopefully make better choices.
Okay, so so you started with I think what people may be shocked by, and I was a little bit when you look at it, but it starts to make sense in the way that you describe the idea for the book. It looks like it's kind of a like self-help advice book.
Yes.
But the way you just described that was you were looking at it from like a sort of like analyzing the industry, analyzing the business model of higher education, but you ended up as this sort of talking about it from the consumer point of view. So talk a little bit more about this sort of the process, because you mentioned you did a bunch of interviews.
Yeah.
So you're looking at the business and the model and how the higher ed is structured and what's wrong with it and how can it do better, and then you end up talking to actual students.
Yeah, so to do the research to make sure we understood why students were coming to college, we basically created over 200 mini documentaries of students actually making the choice around what college they would attend. And these are students all the way from age 17 to age 60 making any post-secondary education decision. And what we did is analyze them to see what were the forces that were pushing and pulling them to make the college choice. What was the anxiety that was holding them back from making this choice, that was preventing them from maybe enrolling in some cases, and then analyze them to understand the jobs to be done, the progress that they were trying to make as they made this choice around why they were going. And so that was sort of the starting point to say, okay, let's understand these different whys and why this is pulling apart the business model of colleges. But then out of that, you have all these student stories, over 200 of them, from a range of backgrounds and so forth. And we thought, gosh, there's a real story here to tell the actual consumers of higher education, to help them make better decisions, to help them be more demand-driven. I will tell you that my first couple drafts of the book were still somewhere split between the self-help and guide for colleges. And the advice that came back from a lot of editors in the first place, my mom's in the audience, she tried to read the first draft and couldn't make her way through it, was basically like, you need to spend a little bit more time with the self-help category. And so literally for about 2 months there, I went on a diet of about 10 or 15 self-help books.
Okay.
So I could really get that into my consciousness, if you will. And so the first half of the book, as you said, it really is a self-help guide for parents and students to make better decisions. And then the second part of the book is, okay, what are the implications for institutions?
Yeah, so because like I think like for the policy audience, you and this is what happened for me. I got into that, into the student stories, and I thought that that's interesting. But I kept wondering, well, yeah, but I mean, do the colleges have to do something in response to this? So and I'm like, you eventually you got there. But I found it fascinating that you did start from this sort of researcher empirical approach and ended up in this self-help thing. So you already mentioned this sort of the jobs to be done thing, and this is the sort of an approach you take at where you work and sort of an analytical framework. Say a little bit more about that, because that's what you use throughout the book.
Yeah, so the jobs to be done theory is this theory that arose out of research done at the Harvard Business School with Clayton, Christensen, and my co-author, Bob Moesta. They're the founders of this theory, and it basically came out of the observation that categorizing the world by demographics or by product category, as companies in the business world tend to do, doesn't actually help you understand what the causal mechanism that causes someone to purchase or not purchase a certain experiences. And you really want to drill down into people's lives and the individual stories to understand what are the trade-offs that they're going to actually make, the priorities that they have in a given moment that causes them to make the shift from one experience to another, from one product or service to another, and so forth. And it's been used by Bob in particular to help companies create literally billions of dollars worth of products and services that are in the market today, including in the education world. Now, this book represents the first time we're trying to flip that around and saying, hey, if consumers have these jobs to be done in their heads, so to speak, of why they're acting, can we actually make that conscious? Can we make that explicit to them so that they can recognize where they are and make a better decision?
So instead of demographics, so you like in the policy world, we're sort of obsessed with demographics.
Yeah.
And we see all problems through the
are.
lens of demographics. So I would say, well, a low-income prospective college student faces all of these problems and struggles and issues, and we need to solve them. But you don't have that lens in here.
Yeah, so the way I would say it is that if you look at demographics, they're not predictive of the causal progress that you're trying to make. And we want to go beyond correlation to actually looking at causality. And just to wrap your heads around it, the quick way to think about what is a job to be done. There's a famous marketing line that the late Professor Theodore Levitt at Harvard used to say, which was, people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they just want the quarter-inch hole, right? They want the outcome from it. The product that they use to get there is sort of beside the point. I would say even that's a little incomplete, because what do you want the whole to do? Is it to hang a fancy picture, or is it just to bust through to get some wiring to get your TV to hang correctly for people, in which case it doesn't have to look so nice. So that's sort of what you're trying to understand. What's that actual progress and the circumstance that helps you understand what the trade-offs that you make will be. Your demographics are not determinative of your particular situation and the progress you're trying to make today in that particular case. Where demographics are useful is in twofold. One, helping you make sure that you understand the universe of cases that might be out there. So it allows you to reach people in different jobs that you might not have otherwise spotted. Yep. And then secondly, on the back end, you layer them back in to give more depth to the causality that's driving people. So just quick example. Some of the students that we talked to were just going to college to do what was expected of them.
Yep.
So they were going because someone else in their life, their parents, an educator, society, had sort of expected that this would be the next logical step.
And this is one of the jobs to be done.
This is one of the jobs to be done.
I'm going because I feel like I gotta go.
Yep,
So that's what college is doing for me here.
These students tend to be very apathetic about the decision. It's all about someone else pushing them to go. They don't really know why they're going or have that intrinsic reason at heart. And what's interesting, though, is that cuts across different demographics. Now, layering in demographics can help you give more nuance to how you could better serve that student or the experiences that you would need to provide for that student to be successful. So it's not that demographics are not useful. They are, but they don't help you understand that progress and that causality itself that's driving someone to take an action.
Yeah, and so that's like one category. The one job to be done is that group of students, but you identified a bunch.
Yeah.
And some that are less obvious than others. The obvious one, I'm sure for all of us, is those who are saying, I absolutely want to go to college and I want to get into this great school and I'm going to try really hard to do it.
Yep.
We know about that group.
Yep.
And I think we have some familiarity with the group you're talking about here, but the others are probably they're more taboo in the DC policy world than they are.
Sure. So the first one, as you said, help me get into my best school. Second, help me do what's expected of me. The third we found is help me get away. So these are students who are running away from something in their life. An abusive stepfather, a family or hometown that just isn't cutting it, a job that doesn't work for them anymore, variety of circumstances, demographics, but they're all running from something, and college is a socially acceptable answer that they can give for why they are going to somewhere. And it turns out, on average, not to be a great reason to enroll in a four-year school, because it's all about running from something, not necessarily the experience itself of why you're going to be there. The fourth one that we found, help me step it up. So these are students that actually like a large part of their lives. They tended to be working adults, not always, who would look around and say, I like this part of my life, but this part of me, this job that I'm working in or something like that, this just isn't who I am. It's not working for me anymore. People are dependent on me, and I've got to step it up. It's now or never. And it was eerie, by the way, when we did these interviews with these people from all sorts of walks of life, they would all use the exact same language. Like, it's time for me to step it up. This wasn't who I am. It was almost like they were programmed. And then the fifth one that we found is what we called help me extend myself. So these are students, they're not necessarily happy, but they're in a good place in their life. They're in a stable place, maybe is the right way to say it. But they've always wanted to learn more, be more, do more. And so they go back to college to learn more and challenge themselves in sort of the pursuit of learning. I joked to my co-author that I had never experienced this job because I've got 2 kids under 5 and a mortgage to pay. His response was, yes, but your equivalent of it, Michael, is hiring a podcast or reading a book. That's extending yourself. So it's not just that these jobs are exclusive to college. Yep. You could actually hire careers or shorter term experiences to help you make that progress as well.
And see, I'm already doing I'm trying to translate all those people you described into demographics. I'm like, oh, those are non-traditional
students.
Ingrained. Those are older, non-traditional students, right? But you're saying not necessarily the case.
Not necessarily the case. And I'll give you a very concrete example of the Help Me Step It Up, which definitely skews right, older, and I think they're layering in some demographics to understand the nuance, super helpful. But J.D. Vance, the the author of Hillbilly Elegy, I would argue that was the job that he experienced when he hired the military instead of college. He looked around him. He actually loved the life that he was in. His sister just had a baby. He was excited about being there. He wasn't running away, but he looked around and he was like, I wasn't the man who I wanted to be. I needed to be something more, and I decided that the military could get me that. And so he hired it to help him step it up, I would argue.
So after sort of identifying these things, you're saying, and I think some people might have like looked at the title of this book and thought, and in fact I know some people looked at the title of this book and tweeted as much and said that, oh, this is sort of blaming consumers and blaming students, right? But actually what you're saying, and when you get to the second half of the book, is you're saying institutions of higher education need to acknowledge these different reasons why people are enrolling, and they need to change in some ways to respond to it, versus, right, which I thought, I was kind of surprised by that.
Yeah, and hugely so. The name of the book, I think, is misleading in a number of ways, but it's a good way to get a hook. It's definitely not blaming individuals. Individuals are living their lives, and they're seeing the options that they have afforded to them, and they're making the choices that they do. And to your second point, colleges and universities can do a lot more to innovate around these options. And as they understand the causal mechanism that's causing someone to come to them, they can say, hey, if you're in this circumstance, this traditional four-year program that we set up might not be the right fit. How do we create a series of experiences that are going to shepherd you through this so that we can serve you way better? Right now, one of the big recommendations we have in the book is around some students ought to take a gap year if they're in a certain situation. For some students, that's not going to be an option, right, for a variety of reasons, financial and otherwise. Wouldn't it be great if colleges actually set up a first year that was more experiential in nature instead of just sort of boring gen ed courses that drive people out? And shepherd them so that you can learn more about yourself, discover who you are, what you're excited about, build passion, and then that college could shepherd you into a path that would actually result in a great job on the other side.
So you talked about, you have examples in there like Southern New Hampshire University, Wayfinding?
Wayfinding Academy.
So maybe talk a little bit about those and why they address, they're a little bit more meeting, I guess the sort of, our language, the DC policy language would be sort of in the advocacy world, would be sort of meeting students where they are, right? So how are they meeting students where they are?
Yeah, so the Southern New Hampshire University story I think is a great one, where it was sort of a sleepy campus that was one of these schools that might have gone under, frankly, and a lot of the small, I'm up in Massachusetts is where I live, so we have a lot of these small liberal arts colleges right now closing, and Southern New Hampshire was on the precipice of that. And the new president, Paul LeBlanc at the time, he's still the president, but no longer the new president. He looked and saw that they had this online division and fundamentally, though, they were treating students that came to their brick and mortar campus and the online as the same type of student. They would get back to them around financial aid questions, 2 months later, because, when you're a high school junior, you can wait that long to get your response. It's not going to change your action tomorrow. But if you're an adult learner looking to step it up in your life, waiting a month or two to get a financial aid information, you've already moved on. You've either selected a program or you've done something else. And so he realized that they actually had to treat the students totally differently based on the job to be done that they were having. And so he separated the online university that they offer. Scott Pulsifer from Western Governors in the audience, so I don't want to get this wrong, but I think Southern New Hampshire is still bigger than Western Governors, or no longer? Depends on how you count it. Okay, but they're one of the largest universities in the country, along with you all. But they used it basically to tap into this job that I think grew a lot of demand as a result, because they redid all of their operations and literally crafted it finally around what does the student in this circumstance need so that they can make progress. And so that's faster response times, faster, clear financial aid rewards, and so forth. And not this sort of coming of age experience that they associated with the brick and mortar campus. So the experience, the actual courses you take and how they're set up are dramatically different as well, and allowed them to lower overhead costs and offer, while not as affordable as Western Governors, a very affordable program that changed the calculation of what those students were experiencing.
So we, one of the things that we talk about a lot, in the policy environment is trying to gauge outcomes at colleges better, getting better information, more data on what students go on to earn, and you kind of drive by that in this book.
Somewhat. So I guess in the book itself, we talk a lot about how punishing it is to go to college, take on debt, and not graduate, right? And how that can really create a overhang over you. We also talk about some of the jobs seem to have significantly higher dropout rates and so forth, and so traditional college experience might not be the right match. So I don't think we gloss over the outcomes, but and I certainly spend a lot of time with my other hats outside of this book thinking about data and outcomes. But what I would say that I took away from this book is that success for different students in these different jobs don't look like what our notions of success necessarily are, right? And so if you're trying to get away, like success is getting away. Success is not necessarily what happens, and then all of a sudden you're in a new job to be done. And the book doesn't necessarily go through all this, right? That you've gotten away and now you're in a new job, and so what does that mean, right? A whole bunch of questions that I don't think are great for a book to answer because they sort of fold in a nonlinear way.
Yeah, I was sort of noticing that 3 times. I was like, so there's sort of, it's focused on like one decision node.
Yeah, I mean,
and then after you're sort of like, it doesn't.
I mean, like, if I'd wanted to write a 1,000-page book, that might have been different. But I wanted something that was digestible and readable and a small form factor. But once you've gotten away, that's actually success for that student. And so, talking to them about all sorts of data about career outcomes and return on investment and debt loads and so forth, it's kind of just noise in a sense because it's not talking to them in the situation that they're actually experiencing at that time. Now, if you can talk to them and present that data in a way that actually makes sense for where they are and says, hey, you're trying to get away. Let's help you do that as cost effectively, affordably as possible without a huge obligation on the other side, and then ask the question of what will be next. Then we can start to ask about some of the data outcomes that I think Washington, D.C. and the policymakers concern themselves a lot more with. But my big admonition would be quality and value are not absolute, and policymakers love to treat them as such. But we can look at this. You can look at a glass that you all have cups right now on the table, and you could say, well, is that a high quality cup? Well, it depends on how you're using it. If you're putting boiling hot liquid in it, it might not be. But for cold ice water, it works really well. And so it's all relative to what you're using it for and the progress you're trying to make. And that's true in college too.
And so you're saying is sort of that people are approaching college for lots of different reasons, but you and so this sort of data outcomes is sort of almost secondary for a big chunk of it.
Well, I would say it's relative, right? What data and what outcomes matter for that job. And that's why it points to another thing, which is that college might not always be the right answer for someone in some of these jobs, even though they are quote unquote hiring college, right?
And you get to say that in a way that with this book in a way that not many of us can get away with. So you reach this conclusion that college might not be right for everybody. And so you're not a big fan after doing all of this of college for all, free college for all.
No, I'm not. But what I might say is I think it's college for all right away after high school is definitely not the right answer. It's not to say that college at some point might not be the right answer. It might be. But the sort of narrative that we've created that it's obviously the next logical step, just like in the early 1900s when very few people went to high school, and then high school, we said, oh my goodness, rising competition with Germany and Japan forced us to make sure that everyone went to high school and graduated ultimately. And that college is analogous to that. That's very unclear to me from the stories that we have gone through and the outcomes that we see, frankly, in college and what they result in. That seems extremely unclear to me that is the right answer. That just making college the new high school will solve societal problems.
And so you mentioned the gap year as an alternative, but what are other alternatives? I mean, so if not college, well, what then?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think we want to see a flourishing of potential pathways, and I think it's a really exciting time right now because we're starting to see that emerge with faster and cheaper programs that are more convenient, meet students where they are, and take a variety of shapes and sizes. So you can see coding boot camps being one of them. On-ramp programs that Strata and others have written a lot about being another one, where they actually support learners and actually hire them right directly out of the program in a temp program, and then actually place them into a job, being another one. I think these so-called hybrid college programs that take online learning and marry them with a very supportive brick and mortar presence, like Duet in Boston, that's an outgrowth of the Match Charter Schools, or Peloton U in Austin, Texas. I think these will be very important programs that start to emerge as well. And I think that we need to broaden our sort of view of learning to become a much more lifelong endeavor that could include stops in a quote-unquote traditional college along the way, but it just won't only or always go through that pathway. And a lot of people have thrown it back, they said, you have daughters, Michael, would you say to them, don't take the college, go to an apprenticeship or go into a trade and so forth? And my answer would be, I would love them to have the opportunity to figure out who they are and what they're passionate about, and then find the most appropriate pathway that gets them there. And if that's college, I'll be thrilled. But if it's a different pathway that makes them happy and brings fulfillment and results in something that they can support themselves on, I'll be thrilled with that as well, because they'll be living true to themselves.
Okay. Well, I have many more questions, but if I keep asking them, I may steal some from the next folks who we're going to have come up here. So bear with us for just a couple minutes while we step down and have a couple of chairs put up here, and then I'll introduce our additional panelists. So it's not just me asking questions. All right, so I'm joined with Carrie Warick to my right, and she's the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the National College Access Network, and she leads NCAN's work to promote policies that support low-income first-generation and minority students' access to higher education. And she has read the book, so I know she has questions. And also Jess Howell. Jess is Vice President of Research at the College Board, and can tell us maybe something about this first group of students, right? The high pressure, the really elite, really selective colleges, and that demographic.
We do hear a little bit about them on occasion. The College Board is an interesting entity that's situated at the nexus of K-12 and higher ed, and so we do see a lot of that trajectory when students transition from secondary to a variety of different post-secondary options. And so I've done a fair amount of research in the space that is covered in your book, which made it a real pleasure to read. And although I know I was asked to read the book with a researcher hat, I did find myself kind of reading it like a mom. So I'm glad that you pointed out that your mom was here, and that the self-helpy advice style really did. I mean, I feel like I should share that with all of you, that for those of you who are parents and who are navigating this, it really did have the effect of having me put on that hat, even though I was going into it with a different hat in mind. So I want to say that the categorization that you lay out in the jobs is actually really, really nice. It is a nice reframe away from the which college to choose, which is what the title sort of leads someone to think, and pulls people back up to the framing of like, why am I doing this? What's the motivation behind it? And I think that is, as a parent, right, that is the motivating thing that we teach our kids to do. And so that really comes through. And because the college choosing process is so fraught with stress and anxiety, I think the way that you guys lay out the book in very clear, delivery of advice, it makes it very easy for a student or a parent to pick up and say, I think this is the job that I want out of a post-secondary experience, and I can go to that part of the book, and there's just very nice, succinct advice. And there's a section for parents who are helping their student, their learner. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that part of the book, because it was really nice. When I put the researcher hat on, which occasionally did happen as I was reading, I noticed a couple of things. So one, you're appropriately, I think, sparse with numbers and statistics in the book. If the design is meant to really speak to the people who have these choices to make, that there are enough statistics in the book that there's salience and information, but it's not overkill. And so that's another thing that I thought made it very readable to the average person. Even if as a researcher I would have bumped it up, I don't think it would have been effective with the audience that you intended. And then as a researcher I sometimes found that I would read something and it would resonate with the parent, as someone who increasingly is thinking about how to have evidence flow into the advice that I give my own kids. But where there would be some tension with something that I knew. And so I'm kind of glad that you guys talked about the gap year stuff already. You reframe it as a discovery year in the book, which I think is super and rather interesting. Most of the evidence around students who take a gap year come from a reasonably affluent and small group. And so I think we have this perception that a gap year can be very successful for students who need to ask to know thyself. But they also have the family support and the cultural capital and usually an institution that they're already attached to. And I think that there are so many guardrails that's one of the reasons we see those successes. So I worry a lot about, and I guess my first question really is about how you scale the concept of a discovery year so that there are enough guardrails for the students for whom normally taking a break in between high school and college would indicate that they wouldn't complete or even go back to college.
Yeah, and I'll use demographics here, by the way.
Yeah.
So, Jason, to counteract what I said before. But I think the evidence in terms of research also suggests that low-income students who do take a gap year are less likely to go back to college. So if they do, it's great. They actually then do better, is what it seems to suggest, than those who just go direct. But the problem is a lot of them don't get to that point. They just sort of stay in a menial job and I would say subsist there, if you will. Now, that's where I think, actually, I hope the book is a bit of a spurring, if you will, of colleges to innovate around this, to partner with some of these new organizations that are coming up, like Global Citizen Year, like Winterline, and a couple others that I mentioned in the book, to either partner so that they can create these curated experiences that actually have financial aid associated with them, and maybe even course credit for the learning that you get during that experience, or that these colleges actually sort of take a page from Northeastern and maybe change it a little bit to actually create more experiential opportunities on the front end. I think we're so trapped oftentimes by this gen ed sequence that you come in, you take your algebra, college algebra, you take your college writing and so forth, that we don't think about the room for innovation. One of the most interesting experiments right now in higher ed that comes out in Education Next, I think in the next couple weeks, that I wrote about, is out of BYU Pathway Worldwide, where Clark Gilbert, the president there, and I wrote about how they simply flipped the sequence, actually, of courses. So they give you a certificate first approach where you go deep into say data analytics in a particular field, and within the first semester or year, you actually have a certificate that has value in the labor market. Those students are then more likely, by like a 23% point increase, to stay on and return for the next year, because they see immediate value from the educational experience that they've gotten. And then they still do the gen ed, but it's actually later on in the learning experience. And I will say, I don't think, and I think we're honest about this in the book, we don't have all the answers. Some of our advice could be garbage. But our hope is that by getting this first draft out there, so to speak, that we're going to learn from a lot of people who come to us and say, like, really good point from here, but actually if you tilted it this way or if someone innovated that way, then you'd actually create a more valuable experience.
Carrie, so you reading this, is all the things you deal with your students and that you're trying to help get into school, all of this ring true, the jobs to be done?
Some of them did. Sometimes I was looking for a few additional pieces. For those who aren't familiar, the National College Access Network is a membership organization for about 500 college access programs around the country. Our members work with students who are first in their family to go to college, students of color, and students who are from low-income backgrounds. So as a good Washington wonk and as representing an organization that has a very specific demographic, which I usually describe as traditional age, but post-traditional in every other sense, I, of course, approach every book I read about, well, what does this mean for our students? Or if one of our students picked up this book, would it be helpful to them? And I think that was the piece where, when I read the section for institutions, I thought this makes a lot of sense because institutions really do need to think about the students they're serving and why those students are there. And I think in many cases focus more on learning outcomes and career outcomes. I really appreciated the parts of the book that said rankings were not a good idea. That I thought that was very helpful. But I think on some of the self-help sections, when I was looking, like what would our students say here, I almost felt that there was a part missing. You downplay affordability, you talked about that with Jason, but for our students, that pretty much comes back to the final decision about where they're going to go. And our members usually help our students craft a list of schools that ensures that regardless of where they get in and get enough money, that then they will be happy going there. And so knowing that that needs to be part of their decision-making process, I thought particularly in the first job that there could have been more of that. But I will say, I read the book in order. I did not do the appendix research or spoiler alert, where I went to the end. And so then when I got to the appendix and started reading about your profile of the students you interviewed, I was actually very surprised to find that low-income working class students were overrepresented, not underrepresented in the sample. So I'm wondering if, kind of how that happened and how, whether or not you were surprised with any of the results you found in the interview.
Yeah, so let me first take the first point on affordability, because I think it's a good one, and I think you're right, that this is part of the value equation. And I agree with you, we could have played it up more, and I think we should have. The one thing I would say is, I think our message is that people, before they jump to the affordability criterion, they would do well to say what else is going on. Because there's a lot more financial aid and sources of support than sometimes people recognize. And all too often, we know that the undermatching problem is real among lower income students. And if they could step back and start to sort by what will actually help me make progress, and money is part of a sort of a value equation, but it's not causal of why I'm gonna do something ultimately. It gives me skin in the game perhaps, but then you can layer in that affordability piece as you decide which of these options are right for me. And I think tools like EdMit, new startup that's emerged to try to give people a much clearer sense of what the financial aid you're likely to get. I think that layered on to a deeper sorting of why am I going could produce some interesting gains for students, and I'd love to see more there. In terms of your other question, we were very conscious about being overrepresented on low-income students, and I will tell you, originally when I was writing the book, I was hoping it was going to be sort of eye-opening for the wealthier readers of some of the realities that students deal with. And then I think we stepped back from it because it just didn't correlate as much as we thought it would with the demographics. And so I knew this from the methodology, and Bob was in my ear, it's not going to do it, it's not going to do it. And I was like, but it's going to do it, because I'm not in Washington, but I breathe the same air. I read all the same reports you all do. And And I was surprised that there was less correlation than I expected in some of these, like the help me get
And when
into
you
my
say
best school.
correlation, you mean so the demographics are correlating with?
I'll be totally honest. I thought help me get into my best school would be way overrepresented on upper income students and underrepresented on low income students, and it just wasn't true. I thought that the help me do what's expected of me. I think I thought that would be more low income. I definitely thought that about help me step it up, and it just doesn't necessarily work out that way. Is what I would say. And now there are personas underneath them, and I think we allude to a few of the personas. I think a deeper dive on this book would frankly be to construct like really deep personas underlying the jobs, and then you'd get really even better advice. That would require a budget that the Gates Foundation wasn't so excited about providing to do that next layer of research. But I agree, like there's more there that would help. But these things are who you are racially and where you sit economically do not determine the cause, what you're trying to accomplish per se in your life.
So, if I could just jump in really quickly, I mean, I found myself thinking a lot about and you mentioned it a little bit, but what do the universities and colleges say? What's their attitude in response to these sorts of things, right? You sort of mentioned, well, in a few places you're like, yeah, I'm suggesting a long-term solution, and these entities are very short-term oriented in terms of revenue. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of it, but I was wondering if I could get you to talk a little bit about how are they going to respond to this? What are they going to say? Do they have sort of excuses? Do they face these barriers that they need to solve to address, to sort of meet students where they are in these different jobs?
Yeah. I'm really curious what you all are going to say to this one as well. I'll give my quick stab at it, which is I think you'll see what you've continued to see in a lot of higher education, which is that there'll be a set of institutions that rise to the occasion and really seek to innovate and create new structures and take it seriously. And community colleges, for example, one of the most striking things to me was the guided pathways sort of finding that fell out, which is, yes, on average, it's working better than just a sort of potpourri of community college courses. Guided pathway being where you sort of select into a meta major and then you run as quickly as you can without a lot of choice in courses through that. But it's not working for all students, and one of the reasons seems to be that they're serving students who aren't ready to opt into that guided pathway. And so if I'm a community college, how do I, on the front end of that, figure that out? And I think we'll see a handful of colleges better understand that and innovate around that. I don't think it's going to be the whole academy, and I think accreditors are going to be a huge barrier in doing some of the things that I talked about around the experiential learning on the front end to help people build more passion and purpose to inform the academic experience that they have. I think accreditation is going to be a huge barrier in this. It's my guess.
I sort of similarly went to the community college space and thought of the CUNY ASAP program, and the real notion that there's an example of an institution really thinking hard and understanding the many barriers that their students were facing, and then developing a program that hit all of those barriers to great effect. I guess the thing that occurs to me is that kind of innovation takes a substantial amount of money. And that's not such a popular conversation in some circles or in some states. And so I think that to put it on colleges, particularly community colleges and public institutions, that I would sort of throw back that the kind of innovation that you hold up as being really important, that I don't disagree with, I think also just takes funding and support.
Although the interesting thing is Arizona State, I would argue, has been the most innovative flagship university over the last couple decades, and their support has been dwindling to zero, and actually they've used innovation as a way to bring in more investment, to bring in more programmatic revenue, because I think what they're realizing through sort of this perspective is actually there's huge demand for education, just not necessarily in traditional college programs. And if you can innovate to offer different programs in different circumstances, you can actually be a thriving community in a variety of ways. And then they've also done a really smart thing on the research side, which is obviously a different piece of the puzzle that's helped them.
I'm glad you mentioned ASU, because what I was sitting here thinking about is how employers fit into this, and the wayfinding college that you mentioned earlier. After 2 years, the students finished with an associate's in self and society, and so I thought, I wonder, what how
they do with
employers
that.
would feel about that. And so ASU is a good example for that because of their partnership with Starbucks. And so you think, oh, if there are employers that might be weary even of online education, then you have a major company like Starbucks partnering with ASU Online to provide a tuition benefit for their employees. But as I agree, the accreditors might get in the way of innovation. I also wonder, with some of these new programs, as students go into them, what will the employers think on the back end, and will they see that value? And I think that's where our advisors get a little squeamish when talking with our low-income students, because they don't have the safety nets to fall back on. If they try something new and the employers aren't on board with it, then they have a degree and not necessarily the financial capital to go try something else.
Yeah, so I was going to ask too about the sort of employers and all of this. Do they have are they a sort of barrier to as Carrie said very well, are they a barrier to the innovation?
So I'll step outside of this book for a second and make a statement about employers, because I think employers are hugely responsible for the situation that we're in, because everyone says, gosh, if colleges would just prepare better students for employers, that we'd all be better off. The reality is that employers are incredibly inarticulate and unaware of the skills and competencies that they actually need for successful employees. And so the signaling problem where they've just defaulted to degrees is because they don't, in many cases, have the precision around these sorts of skills and habits of success that they actually want to succeed. And I think employers need to do a much better job in investing in that function. And I think they'd see a return on investment from it. If their complaining is, if their complaining is impacting their bottom line as much as they say it is, then they ought to integrate backward and actually make the investments in human capital to come up with this. And so I would like to see that. B, in the current world, I do think that's a barrier because of sort of the hinging on a traditional degree. I think you're absolutely right on that. The third thing I will say that surprised me, because I've been a bit of an advocate of employers integrating backwards and either paying for or providing education. I will say we found a strong persona or subsegment of our Help Me Do What's Expected of Me. Most of those students were your traditional 18-year-old student who was going because mom or dad or the guidance counselor or the no excuses charter school said they should go. But there was a clear persona of people who were working, who got a tuition benefit from their employer to go to college, back to college and earn the degree. And they're like, I have no idea why I'm going, because what I'm about to learn has nothing to do with my career path or what I need to be successful in the job. But the employer is going to pay for it all. And like mom always wanted me to have a degree, so I guess I'll do it. And the outcomes were not good at all in this particular subset. And so I worry about like people like me who've been recommending a lot of earn and learn programs, that if you have not aligned the jobs to be done in the employer with the jobs to be done in the students, you're going to be causing you're going to be causing students to take wasting a bunch of time in programs that they're not going to complete because there's no real strategic reason for them to do so. So I think we need to really rethink a lot of these programs that are trying to bring employers in and make sure we're aligning them properly.
Can I ask a sort of related question? One of the things I really like about the book is that there's an overarching theme of lifelong learning, and that the way you lay out your 5 jobs, you're very clear that these aren't really personas, and that like you're one type and that's it,
Right,
that you cycle through them at different points in your life cycle depending upon what you need. And some of those jobs are more likely to connect you to less traditional learning situations. And you do quite a nice job of talking about many of them, from apprenticeships to boot camps to mini boot camps and micro apprenticeships and
all the things, jargon.
Well, I mean, my point is there are a lot of options, and even as somebody who is reasonably familiar with many of those options, my question is about how do we help students navigate those? What's the orbits equivalent of navigating through all of these different post-secondary options and finding the one that matches the job? And then my next, sort of follow-on, which I think is extremely important, is what's the filter that helps us protect them from the crappy options?
Yeah.
There's got to be some sort of a quality lens there, and I know that comes with a judgment, but in some cases, people do need protection from not good option.
Yeah, no, so agree. I think on the first question, this navigation guidance function is something that we need much more serious to think about. I think there's opportunities for tons of innovation around this. It's not clear to me that just sort of a technocratic solution of just throwing data at it is going to help. Like more transparency in the college scorecard and so forth would be wonderful, but I think we're going to need to use that information textured against the progress that someone's trying to make and put it in a much more from the user's perspective, as opposed to sort of just like if we put it out there in Google, they'll somehow automatically suck it into their lives.
Do you need a human?
I
So are
think
you saying you need some sort of a human?
People. I think you need. I think you need a stronger mentor, counselor function, and you know, I mean, I'm sure there'll be some technology that helps with some of this, but I do think we just need to get smarter about how we set up mentors and people that guide people on this pathway, and help you sort through the different options. It's bewildering, frankly, right now out there for even people who study this field constantly, right, to figure out what to do. I do think you also need these programs to commit to making the various outcomes that they deem important from their program super transparent. I mean, I'm involved with the Education Quality Assurance Standards Board. I think it's incredibly important to do audited outcomes on the outcomes that a program claims for itself. And I would hope that if a program legitimately said, hey, we're a liberal arts college that is not responsible for getting people into jobs, fine, you don't have to be audited for how you get people into jobs. Equally, you cannot make marketing claims around getting preparing people for jobs. Like you can't have it both ways. And so I would love programs to say this is the job that we do for individuals, and measure ourselves accordingly to it, and then hopefully that would give transparency into this universe. But I'm sad Bob, my co-author, isn't here, because I think he would have a range of ideas on this one.
But Carrie, this is like what you guys deal with, right?
Yes.
The like navigating all these options and advice. And
So
You're welcome.
Thank you for taking that up for me. So first, I couldn't agree with you more that one arm around one student is what we call it, is necessary. I think the challenge that we're facing as a country is figuring out how to get more mentors there. And this was probably the part in the book where I felt like I oscillated the most, where on one page I was like, oh yes, this is completely reaffirming the importance of mentors, advisors, school counselors, And then on the flip side, thinking about the number of students who come from a background where the only people they know who have pursued careers, who have gone to college, are within their school building, and the ratios in those school buildings are very limiting. The national average for school counselors is 1 to 464. It's recommended to be 1 to 250. In a lot of our urban schools, it's much higher than that. In our rural schools, the numbers might not be as bad, but the counselor might be part-time. So this is where our program comes in, particularly examples like the College Advising Corps that uses AmeriCorps and a near-peer model to put advisors in high-needs high schools. And so they're doing all of that, and they're working with every student through all of the options for that student. But we know that the demand is still not anywhere near being met. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is how do you get more adults, especially for our young people, to serve in those mentoring roles and to make sure they have the training. I mean, I think the last time I looked at the stats, like 10% of master's degrees in school counseling required a course that helped you plan college. So, a lot of the professionals who are doing this are doing it based on their own personal experience and not any training based on the current situation. So there's a lot to unpack there, but it's also a really crucial role that we need to find a way to get more folks into.
Yeah, can I just jump on that? I think it's a miss in the book and it occurred to me relatively early on, and then I decided it's a different book maybe, but my colleague Julia Freeland-Fisher at the Christensen Institute, who wrote the book Who You Know, about the importance of bringing social capital into school buildings much earlier. I think a big takeaway that I had is that rather than relying on sort of a guidance counselor function to somehow scale up to what you needed, we actually ought to be asking questions about how do we redesign high school so that still students have the opportunity to build an understanding of who they are, build passions and so forth, and explore in ways that they don't right now, and be working with outside mentors that bring in social capital into the building, whether through technology or physically, probably both, so that they could start to actually have a support structure around them in much more detailed ways than they do today. And I think a big recommendation that should come out of the book is the number of students going to school without a clue of why they're going is shockingly high, despite the UCLA freshman survey that claims that 90% of students are going to get a job. That implies that they know what a job is. For all the proper focus on academics and test scores and so forth in high school over the last many years, that's come with a narrowing of the curriculum that I think has been unfortunate in terms of excluding the opportunities for some of these experiences and extracurriculars in an intentional way. And so I'd love to see high schools take this and say, okay, and maybe middle schools too, how can we bring social capital more intentionally in a way that builds purpose and then results in people actually having a stronger why when they're making by the time that they get to that question of which college. I'd love to see a change there. The last thing I'd say is I'd also love to see mentor models move away from thinking it has to be one-to-one and thinking it has to be one student to a team of advisors around you, 6, where any one person could be responsible for maybe a little less time, so you could bring more people into it, but you'd have a technology layer coordinating them, working with each other so that you'd get more net advice and more collective wisdom from a variety of fields. I think that would scale better than trying to get one for every single student.
On the why question, I'd love to see, I don't know that it lends itself to a marketable book, but I'd love to see a follow-up where you interview individuals who apply to school or fill out the FAFSA, but ultimately never enrolled to find out that process as well.
And a good jobs to be done study doesn't just look at hiring school, it looks at firing school. And so I'd love to look at people who didn't opt for it at all, and also people who dropped out and look at those reasons much more detailed. That's frankly what I would love to do. Yeah.
One thing, we're not really supposed to talk about, we're not supposed to really care about or talk about the sort of the high achieving student who's all stressed out about trying to get into the best school. But in reading this, I actually I found myself sort of sympathetic with some of those that persona, so talk a little bit about like how things go wrong for those students.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've seen it over the last year in this country with the varsity blues.
Well,
and
yes,
people, parents disowning, right? But I think it's indicative. My piece for Forbes this morning was about this new movie that Lifetime is making around the varsity blues scandal. So you won't want to miss that. But the societal pressure and this anxiety that you've got to go and you've got to go because of the social pressure of showing that you got into the best. It's just enormous. And it creates all sorts of downstream problems in terms of social, emotional health issues, which the New York Times and Wall Street Journal they're quite good at writing about. In terms of, and many more mental health counselors on these campuses that are required to support students and so forth. And I think a large part of this anxiety is students that are not actually choosing in accordance with what would be, with what their why would be, but what they feel like they're supposed to do based on the peer group, their parents and so forth around them. You probably see this constantly pop up in students, but it really does jump out, and I think it's unfortunate. I think the fact that students can't step back and ask what's driving me toward this, and can I find an intrinsic joy in this, is unfortunate. Last thing I would say is, it does occur to me that to help me get into my best school job, if we were to dig into that more, there's probably lots of sub-jobs or sub-segments in it, but one of them is probably those who are going to college for intrinsic reasons, and there's probably those who are going for extrinsic reasons. I'd like to think I was in the intrinsic category, but I do think that filtering that out a little bit would be helpful in understanding where some of the problems arise.
It's interesting. I think my reaction to that is that if you were going to find a way to allow society to have students more likely to follow their own instinct around what job they wanted a post-secondary experience to do, you would have to fix some of the risk associated with dipping your toe in different waters. And the other sort of fact that kept cropping up for me as I read the book was it does have this nice supportive tone that students should be able to test and dip their toe in the water of something that is interesting and motivating to them. But the facts are that small loan balances for non-completers are the big burden when it comes to student debt and the inability to repay that debt. And so I was faced with this sort of tension around how to support more exploration along the lines of jobs while navigating that additional risk, which is counterintuitive to, I think, people who are not in this space.
I think that brings back to the why question as well. And one of the reasons, at least for high school students, why career and also just career pathways, but also soft skills of how to get into those career pathways are so important, particularly for students who aren't getting that type of advice at home, whose parents don't have the types of jobs that need standout cover letters and that sort of thing. So there is a whole why question there that I think we need to talk about career as part of the choice.
Yeah, I attended a focus group. I watched the focus group, and the sort of setup of the focus group was the participants were supposed to eventually get to the point where they were saying they really wanted lots of new data about outcomes from their colleges. That they wanted to, that wouldn't it be great if you had, as a college student, more information about what students go on to earn after leaving the school. And the focus group moderator could just not get them there. In fact, and what I was struck by is at this point of this, and as you're saying, Jess, that they all saw college as this exploratory process, right? Like this sort of like, well, it's where I learned what I was good at and what was out there and what jobs there might be and what jobs I might be able to do. And so, I thought that was, and the way that you're approaching it, Michael, I think seems to be much more in line with that. Right? But I totally hear Jess too on the,
reality.
Yeah, 6 years of trying to find yourself at a four-year university is.
Well, again, I wonder, could you push that into the high school years in a more concerted, design-based way? Because again, and so I'm in no way emblematic of the students you're talking about. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, inside of the Beltway. But I did not know what an engineer or who an engineer was until like junior or senior year of college. I knew what politicians were, I knew what lawyers were, I knew what doctors were. I didn't know engineer was a thing.
Yeah.
And because I didn't have any social capital or exposure to that. And I just think if we could much more intentionally shape middle and high school to have these experiences and meet mentors in these different fields, and have experiences, I think we'd be doing a big service to American education.
So we are a little bit actually over time. We promised you that we would let you ask some questions. So I'm going to open it up. I think, do we have microphones? Cody has a microphone there. So raise your hand if you do have a question, and he will get you one. And nothing? Really? Wow. I guess maybe it would have been better if your book had been out, like maybe for a few months. And then
sorry about that. Then they would have come raging in, with anger.
Can you say a bit more about the blurring of the lines while we tee up a question of high school and college? And obviously the College Board is the AP program, and so we pay a lot of attention to all of those opportunities that bring college coursework opportunities back into the high school. What else would you bring back? And if the lines are blurred, then I think it's interesting that you're not a proponent of free community college. Right? Not to point out.
No, it's fair. And I'm not, because I think there's value for a variety of reasons. But the bigger statement I would say is it's not just the academic experiences. I think it's actually the experiences on the ground of actually learning in these, of working these environments. I mean, the other part that we haven't talked about is the teen labor participation rate in the labor force is the lowest it's ever been in our nation's history. And so a lot of these students, they haven't even had a job, right? And that's for a variety of reasons. Some of that is what they think will get them into a good school. Some of that is the economic realities of where they live and what is open to them. But for both of these reasons, it's really limited, I think, in very unfortunate ways, the opportunities. And so I guess my thought is that middle and high schools should actually actively curate those experiences. And it's like the modern day version of home ec, but like where you actually get your hands dirty. And you know, just as a broader soapbox thing, there's the narrowing of the curriculum that's occurred. I think people thought that that would improve reading and math scores. My read of the evidence on reading is that narrowing the curriculum to just doubling down on reading and English and so forth actually hurts test scores because it hurts your building of a knowledge base, which is important for comprehension. And so that we've actually done the exact opposite of what we ought to do to improve some of this achievement. And I think the same is true with experiential learning and academic learning, which is we've pitted them against each other, when in fact experiential learning can be a great way to build motivation and engagement in a question. And then, yeah, you got to go deep dive and actually learn the knowledge and so forth in pursuit of it. And then you can go back out to another experience. Like Summit Public Schools, I think, does this really well in the Bay Area, where they have expeditions for 8 weeks a year, where you're actually out in the community working a job for 2 weeks at a time. I'd love to see a lot more work around that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to clip the
Do we
question
get
in the audience.
Hi. So you started to get there, but I'm curious if you can elaborate a little bit more on it. So kids are not having gym class in high school anymore. They're not taking art class in high school anymore. And I think what you just said is that you'd like to have that incorporated, which is great. But if we're also incorporating all of this kind of like, you know, building their social capital and having them working and taking home ec again and working all of these jobs and also preparing them for a college level education, I'm curious like how long the high school day will be.
Year-round.
Year-round school so that I can have babysitting. Stepping back, if you, I think, re-engineered again out of classes, like you'd see things that look like trade-offs, like we have to have this or we have to have this, would not actually be necessarily false juxtapositions, if you will. You can teach, if we looked at these based on competencies or what we want people to master as they move through high school or experiences that we want them to have, and acknowledge that they can happen in a variety of settings, not just in an academic class. We don't have to sit there saying, how do we fit in 20 academic classes in a given year? And so it's really a holistic rethinking of what the high school experience looks like from top to bottom. Summit Public Schools, if you look at it, they don't have a 7-period day, right, where you just sort of march through it. They start with I'm going to mess this up, but I'm going to do my best. They start with an hour block of what they call personalized learning time, where it's that strict academics on the computer. Then they have a 2-hour block of project-based learning, where you're actually doing a sustained project, more in a humanities type experience. Then they have then they have sort of open block for physical education and reading and exploration and things like that. And then in the afternoon, it's a couple-hour block of project-based learning and an hour of personalized learning time. And Fridays is all personalized learning time. And then these 8 weeks per year where students get off campus and are working in the community, which actually, by the way, gives the teachers time for professional development that they never get otherwise. It's a radically redesigned schedule that changes your use of time and space and like what exposure students get access to. Not a great answer, but hopefully gives you an idea. Yeah, so it's a good question, though.
Another, yeah.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah, Michael, this is a question, I guess, going back to the policy data that Jason says is not a big focus of your book, but nevertheless, we're so used to thinking of it this way. And I wonder, how do you balance this, listening to students' desires for different kinds of solving different kinds of problems or giving college different kinds of jobs with our obligation to tell them what we know, what the evidence is over decades about the economic returns to higher education of various kinds, notably the BA, also associate's degrees, also different returns by subject. On the one hand, you could have said in 1980, well, there's lots of pathways you could take, but in fact the economy has changed and the returns to post-secondary education have become enormously high. So should we just be agnostic about telling them what to do, or should we tell them what we really know about?
Well, here's my concern. And so I'm going to challenge the premise a little bit, which is what we know or what we say we know is on average statements. on average, it's unquestionably true that a bachelor's degree is better than other pathways that you could have, but there are a lot of interesting anomalies to that. And we don't expose those anomalies and talk about them in a meaningful way because our society is so consumed with averages. And if I sound like Todd Rose, end of average, like I'm absolutely channeling that right now. I just think we need to be clear about the different pathways and give people more information and experience with them so they can make a more informed decision, not so that we can hide the information from them. They should go into something eyes wide open, ideally, but it should be textured against the progress that they're trying to make at a given time. And if we haven't given them the opening experiences, then they're not informed enough to even be able to ask those questions. They don't know what they don't know. And so, I mean, part of this is it's a design problem of how we design the experience of the educational enterprise from top to bottom as a result of it. A lot of the recommendations in the book say middle school and high school are what they are. So what does that mean for what's next in your life? And again, it doesn't say that you won't go to college at some point. It's not clear that for certain students with a certain job to be done, that it's the right next step for them right then and there. And my concern with free community college, just to answer it, is that I think it crowds out a lot of these new options and innovative options that are starting to emerge that could change that calculus pretty dramatically and will cause people to say, I'm doing that because it's the logical next step. Everyone told me I should and it's free, as opposed to what will actually give me value in my pathway. And that's my big concern, is that we're at this really interesting moment in time where I think a lot of innovation is happening, that this could look very different down the road. And I'm not against, by the way, supporting low-income students directly with more financial aid. I am against it becoming a blanket thing for everyone in a regressive way.
Others, sure. Oh, yeah, okay. Cody's been keeping tabs on the queue.
Hey, my name is Jared. Thank you for coming. Before moving to D.C. just recently, I worked with Governor Bryant in Mississippi, which is a state that I think has made tremendous strides in improving its education from obviously being the last in the country. We talked about K through 12 a little bit. What do you think we need to do with teachers? What kind of pressures are we going to put on them so that they can get the training that they need to understand how to educate their students? For example, what they've done in Georgia, where if you're a history professor during the summer, or a history teacher, during the summer, you have to go get an apprenticeship in a career that uses a history degree so that you can inform your students what the class is about, how it applies in the real world. And if we're going to do that across the country, how are we going to compensate teachers? Because states are not willing to raise teacher salaries, but teachers are not going to want to be involved in those kinds of things if we don't pay them more.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess the way I would say it is I'm not a big fan of mandates that say this is the way you have to do it, because it tends, in my mind, to create programs that are big on compliance and not on the actual spirit of the program. I'm much, and so maybe this will contradict people's impression of me from Jason's intro, but I'm much bigger on public systems of creating clear outcomes and then empowering the local educators closest to the context to figure out the right way to do it. And so I would actually strip back a lot of the mandates around the how, make the final yard line much clearer of what we're trying to strive toward, and empower people to figure out different pathways for it, and give a lot more autonomy on the ground to schools and principals. My reading of the accountability era over the last couple decades, before the last decade, but of American education was a lot of people complained about too much business thinking going into American education. I can't think of one business that would say, we're going to hold you accountable for the outcomes, but we're not going to let you on the ground manipulate any of the inputs around your budget, around how you hire, around what you do and so forth. And that's what we've done with education. We've said, you're not allowed to move any of these levers on the ground in schools, but we're going to hold you accountable for this bar, which to me is just insane. And so I think the bar is helpful. I'd rather we looked at individual growth of each student as opposed to just sort of arbitrary targets. But then I'd really like to empower the educators on the ground to make some of these choices. And I think some of them would say, you know what, actually now that we're controlling the budget, we might choose to allocate more to teacher salary here rather than this thing that we thought was important. But I'd love to empower people to make that decision.
So we have time for one more. I know there were some more questions maybe over here if you still have them. Yeah, one more.
I'm very pleased to have the opportunity for the final question, Michael. So one of the jobs to be done that you pointed out has to do with students who are really trying to get away from something. And I don't know how many people present here are aware of organizations like Career Karma, of which I know you're well aware, and other organizations like that, Lambda School, that seem to be a pathway out of the job to be done of showing up at college and realizing that I was trying to get away from something, but I actually went to the wrong place to try to get away from it. I'm wondering if you can talk about that kind of student a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't given enough thought to this, so I'd love to think about it more with you. But my take on it is something like Lambda School, but probably actually even shorter term, frankly, than what they are, right? Because, yeah, I think Career Karma is probably closer to it. That gets them away. Like, it's really important that they get out. They have to make that progress. That is success. And now they've pivoted to a new job, and that job might be like, who am I? I'm not exactly sure how they would formulate it, right? And then meets them there, I think is really important. A short burst program like that could be perfect because it's not asking them to pay cost to get that education up front. It will put them into a job. My only worry is that if it's too long in duration and you realize midway through that like this isn't for me, that all of a sudden you're stuck with, and I don't know how the ISA contracts, and the income share agreement contracts on this might work, right? Because you're supposed to pay back a future percentage of earnings, but you go into, say you do 3 more educational experiences and then you take another job, like, would your income have to accrue back to that first experience even though it didn't contribute? Like, I think it would, right? Yeah. And so I think that's something that is not yet, I don't think we've worked out that interface correctly for students in this Help Me Get Away job.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's all we have time for, so I want you to join me in thanking the panelists here, and particularly Michael for coming talking about his new book.
Thank you. Thank you.